Oh, perfect. The recording just began, Dee, so we're on perfect timing. So
we're on perfect timing. Great.
You go ahead and introduce yourself.
Great. Well, thanks, Bob. My name is Dee Pettack. I am the Policy Initiatives Advisor for the Office of the State Superintendent. I am now serving with Dr. Jill Underly, and this is my third administration I have served with. And prior to coming to the department, I worked as the Chief of Staff in the State Senate. And I'll kick it over to Bob.
Good afternoon, everybody. Bob Soldner. I've been at the department for quite a few years now. Started in 1998. I've been in several different roles. I'm currently serving as the Assistant Director on the School Financial Services team. And this is, Dee and I have been doing this a few years in a row. So how we're structuring it today is Dee's going to kick us off, go through the first half of the presentation on some demographics and numbers as the landscape looks like in Wisconsin. And then I'm going to do a very high overview of school finance, kind of talking about how the pieces come together. And then we'll have a couple of closing slides in terms of where we think things are going or what do we think are some takeaway points. And if you have questions, go ahead and ask them as we're going through. That'll be good. So Dee, take it away.
Okay, great. I'm just going to stop my video. I apologize because it's kind of taking up some of my screen here. So thank you all for attending School Finance 101 with Bob and I today. I think this is our third or fourth year that we've presented this presentation, and we keep adding to our slide deck every year. So first, I just want to talk a little bit about the student enrollment options that are available for our students here in Wisconsin. The vast majority of our students attend a traditional public school. That would be your neighborhood school, the one closest to your home that your students already assigned for. A within district transfer, meaning you transfer to a different school within the school district boundaries in which you reside, or open enrollment, meaning you transfer to a school outside of the district, your resident district. We also have three types of charter schools. We have an instrumentality, a non-instrumentality, and an independent charter school. And really the difference between those is who is the chartering authority. Is it a local school board, meaning your school district is in charge of that charter school? Or is it an organization or a body that is outside of your school district? That could be a UW school or Bob, help me out here, a technical college or Milwaukee County, the city of Milwaukee, if I'm correct, that would take all three of those, right?
Yes.
And then we also have virtual charter schools, and those can either be within your district. So if your district hosts a virtual charter school, or you can open enroll to a virtual charter school that is outside your resident district. We have several private school programs. We have the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, the Racine Parental Choice Program, the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program, the tuition, private tuition paid program, where a student would just be private pay from the parents or guardians of that student. And then I would just add on here, we also have the SNSP, which is a special needs scholarship program, which applies to any school that chooses private school, which chooses to sign up for it, whether or not they're within the other parental choice programs that currently exist. We also have homeschool as an option, which in Wisconsin is a bit different from other states. We do not provide any type of curriculum or materials for homeschool students. Those are all procured by the parents or guardians of the student. We also have dual enrollment programs, which students in public and private schools can participate in, including the early college credit program, getting transcripted credits from a higher institute of education, or taking AP or international baccalaureate classes. Also introduced, I would say, within the last 8 to 10 years would be whole grade sharing. And that is where districts can work together to provide perhaps a joint middle school or something of that nature. I do not believe at this point, despite there being a financial incentive, we have had any school districts join in a whole grade sharing program. So just a snapshot, as I said, the vast majority of our students, 81.7%, over 805,000 students, attend a traditional public charter school. 2.7% attend an in-district charter school, and less than 1% attend either an independent charter school or a virtual school. We have 7.1% or just over 70,000 students who attend a private non-voucher school, and 4.4 or 43, almost 500 students that attend a private voucher school. Homeschooling, we have about 2.2% of our students, and a small number of our students attend a tribal school here in Wisconsin, just under 100 students. So over 80% of publicly funded students attend a school overseen by a local school district, or I'm sorry, a local school board, whether that be a traditional public school, a district charter, or a virtual district charter school. What we've seen in the past throughout our state is that we have seen the percent of economically disadvantaged students change drastically over the years. Nearly 1 in 3 of our districts have student populations that are more than 50% economically disadvantaged. And what our map is showing you is, as it changes, the growing poverty, specifically in our rural areas across the state. You can really see clusters of lower poverty rates that center around our southeastern, south central regions, while our northwestern, northern regions, and southwestern regions are seeing the highest growth in poverty over the last decade. And I'll just let that map finish out for folks who are still watching that. We're going to be coming up on 2021 here. And I do anticipate we will see some changes in this map as we start pulling in our poverty data from our most recent year. This kind of maps interestingly, I shouldn't say well, with the percent of districts that are experiencing declining enrollment. Our declining enrollment districts have increased from 52% of our school districts in 2006 and 7 to 69% in 2021. Today, 75% of our district students are located in just 30% of our school districts. So when you think about the map we just saw, and then you look at this map, as we watch it change over time, you can see the darker colors represent the greatest amount of loss of students. So the blue gets darker blue, and then you see that cluster of yellow really around the Fox Valley, around the border areas, and southeast and south central Wisconsin. As I said, today, just 75% of our students are located in about 30% of our school districts. So more than half of our students attend districts with fewer than 1,000 students. So 53% of our districts have under 1,000 students in them. And these are those two maps when we put them together, ending in 2020, 2021. And you can really see a lot of similarities in the population change and the poverty sort of matching up. So the folks who had the most means to move from districts have relocated in many cases to some of our more suburban, less rural, northern areas. You can also see where we've mapped this, and it shouldn't be probably surprising to anybody, but you see the most population growth and student density around our major interstate systems. You also see our least economically disadvantaged students clustered around our major university centers and our post-secondary institutions. So the first map highlights our enrollment change, layered on it with the major highways for 2020, 2021. And the second map highlights the university systems, which are the red circles, and our technical college systems, which are the red triangles. And you can see those clusters of the economically disadvantaged lightening in those areas. We also know, as we look at our student population, the number of homeless students and students having out-of-home experiences throughout the year is growing. I anticipate we will see a spike in these numbers as the eviction moratorium has come to an end. We had a little bit of a decline in 2019-20, but as I said, I expect that when we see those numbers from the pandemic and as we're trying to come out of the pandemic, those numbers could change. 50% of our homeless students are in just 7 districts in the state, but almost every district has at least one homeless student that will require extra services. As you can see, Milwaukee has by far the highest number, with just over 4,700 in the 2019-20 school year, followed by Madison, Green Bay, Racine, Beloit, and Janesville. But again, every school district, almost every school district across the state, will be providing services for one or several students who are experiencing out-of-home situations throughout the year. And we know that poverty impacts achievement. It's not the only reason, but it certainly has an impact. So when we look at our factors based on our free or reduced price lunch, we see our highest poverty also really highly correlates to our lowest performing schools. And you can also see that down here with the cluster of purple dots with our low poverty, highest performing schools. But we know that poverty doesn't explain it all. We also know there's other situations that are in some ways tied to poverty. And we know that we've seen in MPS mobility greatly impacts our MPS graduation rates. We have heard of students who have to change schools, sometimes upwards of 3 to 4 times a year. And what this rate shows is that the number of high school students attend greatly impacts your likelihood to graduate. So Milwaukee's district graduation rate is at about 69%, whereas our state graduation rate is at 91%. And our data shows that consistent enrollment improves outcomes for all students, whether you're an open enrollment, choice, charter, virtual, or traditional public schools. If you attend the same high school all throughout your 4 years, you have an 82% chance of graduating in Milwaukee. Whereas if you attend 4 or more, your chances drop to only 30%. I think that's an especially relevant conversation right now as we talk about the mobility of students and the likelihood of this eviction moratorium ending and the impact that will have on families in some of our more urban areas and across the state. So we know that we have many changing faces across the state of Wisconsin. Our latest data from the US Census says that in 2019, only 19% of Wisconsin's overall population identified as people of color. But in that same year, 31% of Wisconsin's public school population identified as students of color. And some of the districts on here may surprise you. Others are probably ones you would think of right away. But overall, we have 19 majority minority districts in the state. So these districts enroll 23% of all of Wisconsin's public school students. The Menominee Indian, Bayfield, Brown Deer, Arcadia, Gresham. These are all school districts that serve a wide variety of students that bring different needs into their classrooms. I know a lot of the talk today has centered around achievement gaps and closing the gaps. And while we've talked a lot about poverty, that just simply can't explain all of the racial achievement gaps we see across our state. We know that students who are white and economically disadvantaged in general will perform better than students of color who are not economically disadvantaged. So we have to look at what is feeding into that as we look at these performance measures of percent proficient and advanced on both our English language arts and our mathematics. And as we move out of that conversation, I think it really leads nicely into where I'm going to switch it over to Bob Soldner. And he is going to start talking about how our school finance system and the decisions made by our legislature in the past several budget cycles work in conjunction with what I would say are changing student population and the department's goal of closing gaps. So with that, we're going to pause. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to let Bob share his, and I will take over monitoring the chat.
All right, bear with me as I share my screen. Here we are. Well, as I go through it, sorry about that. It won't take me too long. Okay, and go ahead, and Dee will grab, if you have a question, go ahead and stop me as we go through. School finance is complicated in Wisconsin. I think the important thing to know about school finance is it is based on membership. And so one of the highlights, and you see from the map, are a couple of things that Dee went over in terms of demographics. We're in a declining enrollment state. So our 421 school districts, 69% of those districts are in declining enrollment, and membership, a way of counting students, full-time equivalency. Our school finance system is based on the number of students. And so clearly almost 70% of our districts are in declining enrollment. And that means in the state of Wisconsin, in school finance, revenue limits really starts the conversations with school finance. So the school districts in Wisconsin each have a unique revenue limit. It has its basis in what the district was taxing back in the mid-90s. The state imposed revenue limits. And it's calculated in essence on the revenue that a district collects from state aids and property taxes divided by a 3-year rolling average membership, and that gets revenue limits. Then the state distributes the largest pot of school aids, almost $6 billion. That's B with a B is in billion, $6 billion in state equalization aid. And we give that number on October 15th. We calculate it, the department does. And you take that number minus revenue limits and you get your maximum amount of property tax levy. All right. And so again, that levy is about 70 to 90% of the available revenues the district has to spend. So the vast majority of its dollars are restricted by the state on this formula based on membership. And then the rest is outside revenue limits. Categorical aid are several, couple of dozen specific programs like transportation aid, special education aid. Per pupil aid is the largest categorical aid. It's $742 per FTE. Federal funds and then other funds, other revenues in terms of fees that are collected. And so the table that I've updated here is the annual increase allowed for revenue limits, and then when per pupil aid was created in the 12-13 school year, you can see per pupil aid is orange and the revenue limit is blue. You can see 6 out of the last 8 years revenue limits have been held to $0. And what that means is when a district's revenue limit is held to $0 on an increase per that 3-year rolling average membership, is they get no bump in revenue limits from year to year. And so as happened this year in terms of the legislature, when additional school aids, general school aids are provided by the state, if there's no increase in revenue limits, and it's going to be $0 this next fall and $0 the following fall, that means all that state aid money has the sole purpose of reducing property tax levies. Because if a district doesn't get a per pupil revenue limit increase, they're not able to spend any new state dollars, right? So that's kind of a fundamental building block in terms of how school finance works. This is just another slide to show you a little bit differently graphically what's controlled by revenue limits: general aids and property taxes. Like, as I said, 79% of a district's revenues. And then the rest of the revenues, 30 to 10% is categorical aids, any grants that a district could be eligible for, mental health grants that are available now. referendum approved debt, and any fees that are raised. Those are all spendable outside the revenue limits. Now, in terms of school district revenues, it's really, and this is statewide, 41% from local property taxes, 38% from state general aids, and then 21% from the other sources of revenue. And as I said, other sources of revenue primarily for categorical aids, big ticket numbers, large dollar amounts are per pupil categorical, and then the state special education categorical, along with all the federal dollars and non-property tax revenue, fees, and other dollars that the district can raise in terms of interest. Those are the other sources of funds. So again, Wisconsin primarily funds with general aids and property tax levies levied by your local school board for school purposes. All right, so we're gonna leave revenue limits and talk a little bit about membership and what it means. And membership is used both in revenue limits. As I said, it's a 3-year rolling average, the September count, and then general aids is inclusive of the third Friday in September, but also includes some January count and then summer school. But first, and I don't want to get into the details, but the department provides an actual executable Excel worksheet that's pre-populated and is the state law on revenue limits. And revenue limits are comprised of the third Friday in September count. That's the big count date. We've been talking about that date. So third Friday, September, summer school FTE, which is only 40% of the summer school FTE is counted in the district's 3-year rolling average. And then the state funds charter schools, independent charter schools, a little bit differently. There was a big change in law this year, but I'll focus on the newly authorized charter schools. Those are colleges that were given additional authority beyond UW-Milwaukee and UW-Parkside, tribal colleges, some county executives, UW Extension. And again, the three-year average. So revenue limits, 3-year average, third Friday, September, 40% of the summer school. And then primarily Madison and Milwaukee have the new independent charter schools, but there's a couple others that are added to that revenue limit count. And so revenue limits, as I said, is a 3-year base revenue. And so revenue limits conceptually are all the money the district received through property tax levies and general school aids the year before, divided by what we call the base 3-year rolling average, which would be the 3 prior years, not including this fall, multiplied by that 3-year rolling average. And then the current 3-year rolling average, which in this fall will be fall of September of 21, September of 20, and September of 19. So we're using 2 different 3-year rolling averages, covers a period of 4 years for revenue limits. Now, equalization aid, general school age, again, $6 billion that the state distributes. It's based on what we call general aid membership, which is the third Friday in September. This is last year's 2021 data will be used to generate 21-22 general aid. And it's based on third Friday, September of 20, second Friday in January 21, average that count for this is Milton Cross Plains, by the way, 7,290 plus 100% of the summer school. And then the prior year kids that participate in the voucher programs in terms of Wisconsin and Racine, the special needs scholarship program that Dee talked about, and those newly authorized, we call them new authorized or charter schools, along with some very small group of homeschool and private school kids attending some courses. So complicated, but same group of kids, but to really walk away from the kind of school finance at a high level is membership plays a big role in not only calculation of revenue limits, but also how the state distributes general aid. And so this year's aid formula really, we call it factors. It's the state shares costs on what districts spend in the prior year, the number of kids that I just explained have counted, the 2 count dates, September, January, plus summer school and a handful of other kind of kids, including voucher school kids, and property value. And so we use those three factors to run a formula, in essence, competing. 421 school districts will compete for this money based on shared cost per pupil. Again, that FTE is real important, and equalized value per pupil. Now, I just throw this in here to let you know that equalization aid is a complicated formula, but it's based on simply what a district spends every year, the number of kids they have, and their property value. And we divide the costs into three categories. First $1,000 in costs up to the secondary cost ceiling, which ends up being 90% of the average cost. And any money above that secondary cost ceiling is funded at different levels. The state puts more dollars for the first 1,000 in costs. Then a large chunk of the money comes into the next $11,067 in the estimate for July 1 for this next year, and then cost above that. And it's based on property value. And so as a district's property value per member is at the state average property value per member or less, it'll generate more state aid. And so, and if your costs are less than average, you'll generate more aid. So the state shares in the cost of running school system based on property value. So if you spend less than the average and have property value less than the average, the state puts more money towards those dollars. Okay. A little bit on the 2021 general school aid deduction. This is money that's pulled off this pot, generally talked about for public schools. This is last year's. We will have next year's in come October 15th. But $252 million was pulled off, which is about 5% of total general school aids for the different programs. And this is a table that shows it. Independent charter schools, the legacy schools. I will say the legislature made it, I considered an improvement to the formula. Starting this next school year, they will no longer take a deduction off of all districts' general aids. It's going to be funded straight from the general fund. So I view that as an improvement, an equity improvement to the formulas. But charter schools are funded this way. Milwaukee Parental Choice Program funded by partial deduction of Milwaukee's aid, Wisconsin Parental Choice, the Racine Parental Choice, and was the statewide program and special needs scholarship. $252 is removed from this past year, removed from general school districts aid and distributed to these operators of the independent charters and then the private schools. So the last bit of money that's not controlled by the state and is based on appropriations is categorical aids. As I said, there's many different kinds of categorical aid programs. Some of the more common ones are transportation reimbursement, high cost transportation, the per pupil aid, that's $742 per child, special education that we've talked a lot about the last two sessions of the legislature in terms of the state sharing in the costs for districts to implement FAPE or children with determined to have special needs under federal and state law. And then sparsity aid and supplemental aid and some of the smaller ones. Common School Fund, every district gets categorical aids for those programs. Those monies are outside the revenue limit and can be spent for the purposes described by law. Again, per pupil aid is $742 per pupil. That's going to be held constant from the last 2 years and in the next 2 years. So this next year and the following year will be $742. Governor Evers vetoed the last budget and provided just over $3 additional for per pupil aid this past year and the year before. So it was about $745 per child. This has not been updated yet. This chart that talks about the state's commitment in terms of the general fund has decreased. That is, the state has provided less sharing of local school costs. I will tell you, it's going to pretty much level off. The fiscal bureau still, legislative fiscal bureau staffs the legislature, and they're working on their budget summary for this 21-23 biennium. But it's pretty much going to be funded level. If you remember the conversations that have been happening the last month and a half about the legislature providing just enough state aids to meet the federal requirement to keep those coronavirus dollars under ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 flowing, ESSER 1 also, in terms of maintenance of effort. So that 2021 line is pretty much going to be straight lined out for the next 2 years in terms of the state's commitment. This is a table, again, not updated because the Legislative Fiscal Bureau is still working on their summaries, but you should know that the state's general fund, general tax dollars, income and sales tax, controlled by the state, 32.5% of the state budget goes towards general school aids in terms of general and categorical aids. And then some of the highlights, the school levy tax credit, a little over $1 billion or 5.8%, and then the private vouchers at 1.9%. This is a chart, and Dee and I forgot to mention our policy budget and research team. Aaron Fath is the director. We've got a couple of researchers, very smart and intelligent folks. They have updated these numbers, including the referendum through June of this year in terms of the changing demographics, declining enrollments based on what we have publicly available. So shout out to that team doing great work for us. Got us that information this weekend, so that was great, just in time for us to use today. You can see the referendum is still at a decent passage rate of 78%, but you can see the passage rate was above 80 and then just dropped below. But most recently, it's still above 50%, but dropping some. These are the numbers in terms of the voters really do support school referendum. And it's an important, and right now, particularly when the legislature gives $0, as will have for 6 of the last 8 years, if districts want to increase money to meet just costs of living, inflation, they're going to have to either cut their base budgets, or they're going to have to go to the voters to ask for relief to the state imposed revenue limits. So, Dee, if there are any questions, I think you're following along on your slides potentially, but we're at moving forward in terms of improving achievement. So I'll hand it back over to you.
Okay, and Bob, I'm going to ask you if you can just keep your screen sharing so I don't have to go through the slides again. That'd be great. Yeah. We don't have any follow-up questions in the chat yet, but we will take some time and pause at the end. So I just want to say, I think, as Bob has illustrated, even despite that we had a slight dip in the referenda passage rate this past year, I mean, I think part of that could likely be explained due to the economic uncertainty due to the pandemic, folks being a bit more cautious. Certainly understand that. Also some uncertainty probably with the federal dollars that were coming through, but I think the overall message is that the public is with us, and we see that through the passage rates. We also see positive improvements in our school. We have increased graduation rates, lower number of dropouts. I'll caution this a little bit with prior to going into the pandemic, we did have increased attendance, fewer suspensions. We had a record number of students and college credits received. Also, I would say we had one of our highest years prior to the pandemic of career and technical certifications received by our students. While we did not have a youth behavior and risk survey this year, we had been seeing a lower number of alcohol and drug usage, and are hoping that has continued throughout the pandemic, although we know we have seen higher challenges with mental health, but we are also seeing improvement achievement across our student groups. A recent or a spring of 2019 Marquette poll showed that the majority of voters, I believe was 71%, supported raising taxes for their schools and opposed further education cuts. And as Bob mentioned, our referenda pass rate has soared to the high 70 percentages, where it used to be at 53% in the prior 20 years. So we have seen the public rally behind our public schools, and a lot of that is due to the great work that WPenn has been working on. Next slide, Bob. So the summary of our challenges that our state is facing is that schools are much more diverse. And we also know, I guess, on that part of that conversation is that a lot of our workforce that serves in our schools has not grown at the same pace as the diversity of our students. And we know that a lot of our students benefit greatly from having somebody in a leadership position or a mentor in their school who looks like them. We have 69% or more after this year of districts that are going to be in declining enrollment. And that presents a lot of challenges because we know that just because you lose 2 students or 5 students, it doesn't mean you can get rid of a classroom teacher or cut your electric bill or any of the major costs that come with schools, from transportation to special education. We also know that poverty has exploded, but it has not yet been addressed in the school finance system. We have seen a lot of proposals that have dealt with weighting students for poverty, because we know that they come into the classroom in many cases with much greater challenges that other students who are not economically disadvantaged do not experience, including their access to quality early childhood education. And we have seen that the pandemic has only exacerbated that situation with the closure in many cases where we were already on the verge of having a childcare desert to definitely pushing us into that phase. And that is a huge component of making sure our kiddos are ready when they come into our schools and have equal access to not only our public education, but also quality early childhood education systems that will prepare them for being tomorrow's learners. We also know that voucher expansion is straining the system. Instead of funding vouchers with a straight general purpose revenue stream, the legislature has created a funding system which runs through our school systems, essentially raising the taxes of making public school districts raise their taxes to pay for these students. And it is putting a strain on everybody. And it is not equitable across school districts in the state. However, as we see this program grow, what first started as Milwaukee, Racine, more Fox Valley situation, it is spreading to our rural districts, and they are going to start to feel that strain very soon as well, if they have not already. Anything to add there, Bob?
No, and I think the voucher funding, in terms of the strain, it's a really twofold, right? So if you and we'll provide the slides, the WPN, to get it out in terms of today's PowerPoint for you all. But as the voucher program is expanded, it's the strain is twofold, as I said. So as the state funds tens of millions of dollars for the voucher expansion, what happens is districts that have residents that are attending a private school under a state voucher, the state lowers that district's general school aids and then tells the school, we're going to take this state money from you. So let's say $110,000 is going to be used to pay for residents of that school district that have chosen to attend a private school. And the state will pay that private school $110,000 in terms of vouchers. Then the school board will lose $110,000 in their state aid, and they have to decide whether they want to raise property taxes by $110,000, or they have to cut their base funding for their public schools, or they have to go to their fund balance, right? And so that's a strain on the system on an annual basis. The cumulative effect is, as I mentioned, for the next 2 years, the legislature has provided $0 increase on revenue limits. All right, so all costs are going up: salaries, utilities, heat, running school buses is going up, right? And so either a district has to cut those base expenditures, or they have to go to their voters, right? And the district may not have increased its levy at all for its school operations, but has consistently been increasing its levy to pay the private school voucher program off their property tax base. But the voters don't know that, right? And so it's a cumulative effect as this program, private school voucher program, expands, the state funds that through a local property tax increase, does not fund it straight out of the general fund. And so that's the dual strain on the local school board and the local school community. Thanks, Bob, for expanding on that. I appreciate that.
All right, I think we can move to our next slide, which may be the last one.
Yeah, that was the last one.
Oh, that is last. Sometimes I was going to say I put a picture of my kiddo to sum things up because sometimes folks wonder why I do this job. And I think Bob might feel the same way when it feels a little bit like banging your head against the wall, especially when you're working with the legislature and folks are just not hearing what we're saying. But the reason I do this is for my 11, soon to be 12-year-old kiddo who is going to be going to school right here in Sun Prairie at Patrick Marsh next year. So I think that for him and his classmates and every kid across Wisconsin, they deserve equitable access to quality services, no matter what type of family they come from, no matter what the color of their skin is. And I just think this pandemic has really exacerbated the needs and the disequities in our system that we have and the challenges that we face. I think it's really shown a spotlight on the work we have to do, which is a lot of work. But I'm excited to be embarking on this under our new state superintendent, Dr. Jill Underly. I'm excited that she is going to take these challenges head on, and we are not going to let up until we do what's right for every kid every day. So with that, I'd love to open it up to questions. If anyone wants to deep dives on school finance, you have the man here you need to do that with. Bob is, I often say there's few people who understand the school finance system better than Bob Lang, but I would say he's on par there with Bob Lang and Brian Ponke in terms of being the geniuses behind the math. So please feel free to drop it in the chat or just unmute yourselves and chime in. We'd love to hear from you and answer any questions you have.
Are there any questions of the people that are here in the room with us today? Yes.
Yeah. So I am a principal in Hamilton School District, and one of the things they talked about were the revenue limits that were established in the mid-90s. And our district, like many districts, is much different than we were in the mid-90s. So what are there actionable steps that school districts or community members can take to address those revenue limits that seem like they were established in a time so different?
Yeah. So Bob and Deanna, could you hear that question?
Yeah, I could. Yeah, literally the only, well, revenue limits are, let me start. Revenue limits are based on student membership and folks moving to your community with children and attending your schools. But short of that, the item that's controlled by the boards are convincing your public, taking a look at your finances based on what it costs to run your school system, the level of school that you want to provide in your local community, and really going to referendum to exceed revenue limits, right? Voters can approve, and they have approved many referendums as we shared in the slides. Referendums are about exceeding the revenue limit, either for building or for operations. And for operations, there are two types of revenue limit exemptions: recurring or non-recurring. Non-recurring is just the board asks of the community to approve a 5-year or 3-year increase to their local property taxes to run the school. That's non-recurring. Recurring is they ask them for moving forward into the future. That literally is the only relief valve a school board has in terms of what they can control, in terms of asking the voters to expand that revenue limit picture that froze you in place back in the mid-90s.
Does that answer your question?
It does. It just it seems like it's just such a cycle that feels like it's never going to end unless we go back and kind of revamp for the whole state what those revenue limits are based on who we are today, versus mid-90s. So yeah, it's unfortunate that there's not a more systematic way to address that instead of district by district going to referendum. But
or is there, do you have recommendations on how community members, parents with children in our public schools, or people who work in the schools could advocate for changing either the system or the existing revenue limits at a state level?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and WPN does a great job at advocating for change and has a good formula for success. It's a lot of hard work. It does start with conversations with your elected officials. In the case, I would start with my school board, right? Locally elected school board members, and make sure everyone's on the same page there, because if you can't convince your neighbors that it's a good thing, you're not going to convince anybody else. And it starts there, and then it goes to your state representative, your assembly person, and your senator, right? Because it will take a law change, and unfortunately, the legislature keeps promising they will change, and they did a blue ribbon commission 3 years ago and didn't really adopt any of the blue ribbon commission recommendations, and many folks on both sides of the aisle supported that change, but it hasn't happened yet. And so it's a slow process. It can be very frustrating. But I will say, and even this last time, like Dee said, the last 5 years, it's a 78% pass rate on referendums, and the public opinion polls are saying voters support raising taxes for local schools. They do. Those are the facts. It's not easy. You got to convince your voters. But I think it starts with your school board, and then your school board working, and you working with your local elected assembly folks and senators.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room?
I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, because I'm pretty new to this, but is the best way to get schools more money is to have more people in the district?
Could you hear that one?
I just cut out a little bit. Did it say increase the number of kids is the best way under revenue limits?
Yeah, is that the best way to get a district more money, is simply to just have more kids?
Under revenue limits, yes. It all starts with that 3-year rolling average membership, which is the third Friday in September student count, along with 40% of your summer school program. And so one of the immediate things, I guess this is an immediate issue, but you have to have the money to do it, right? Schools can expand their summer school program, because their summer school program counts 40% of that FTE counts to increasing your revenue limits. But it's kind of one of those issues. You have to build it and hope the students come, right? If you build it and they don't come, you just spent money that you're hoping to get an increase on your local revenue limit picture, right? So it's tough, but school finance in Wisconsin, particularly revenue limits, starts with membership. Now, how the state distributes the $6 billion in general school aids is much more complicated. And so I'd have to look at the individual district to see where the district is. We call it positively aided or negatively aided. And so if your district is less than the state average property value, spends majority less than the 90% of the average cost, you're going to get more state aid for every dollar you spend, right? But not every district is in that spot in the formula. So it gets a little bit more complicated on the mix of property taxes and state aid, but revenue limits is based on student counts, the third Friday, September, and summer school counts.
I would also just chime in on that one that, a couple of the other proposals which have been in the DPI's budget, supported by the governor and WPEN, would be increasing the funding for kindergartners if they're attending full day from 0.5 or 0.6 to a full 1.0 FTE. That would help with the revenue limits as well. And then also, again, revenue limits, I think, are kind of that sticking point right now that we're all bumping up against. And the problem is that it really depends on your community's ability to pay. And their willingness to raise their taxes, which coming out of a pandemic is going to be challenging for everyone, right? These are tough conversations to have as a community, especially when there's so many needs across the community. So we continue to make that push with the legislature. We've had incremental successes in the past, but as Bob Soldner said, this year they held us flat on those revenue limits, meaning any additional aid they put in was just a property tax decrease.
And then, so you said that $742 per kid. Would it take a law change to raise that number?
Yes,
Yes, it would.
all we're talking about requires law change, right? DPI DPI just administers the law as the legislature and governor signs it into law. And so that would be a law change, correct? And both our agency and the governor recommended increases to revenue limits per member and per pupil categorical aid. Also talked about indexing it to poverty to provide more dollars for districts with kids in poverty. And that was not adopted by the legislature. So.
Yes, another question.
So to that point of raising more money going towards students with greater need, when you look at the total state money going to schools, so not just the general state aids, but kind of the whole pot, is that overall progressive, regressive, or neutral?
Well, it's kind of how you measure that, whether it's regressive or not. I think there's a little bit of a mix, right? I mean, $742 per pupil, regardless if you have property value. Which the formula says a district has wealth or doesn't have wealth based on property value, not income. There is no income factor in terms of what people are making in an area. So the recreational lake properties in northern Wisconsin and other areas of the state, they have high property value. They get very little state aids, right? And so the distribution is based on property value, and that's been that way since the Equalization Aid formula was created in the 70s. And so I would say that's a progressive way of funding it, right, based on local property taxes. And what the concept is behind that is, regardless of the property value behind the community, the state says if you want to have equal provision of a educational system locally, school boards deciding, you'll have about the same property tax impact, whether you have low property value or high property value. Obviously, if a school board has high property value, they have to have a smaller mill tax to raise the same dollar amount. For someone in low property value, they could double the mill rate, right? So high value districts are taxing $4, low value districts are taxing $10 per thousand, right? The mill rate. So that state aid formula equalizes that to say you should be able to provide a similar program for the same tax burden on local taxpayers, right? That's what that $6 billion really does, which I really think is why Wisconsin has such a strong K-12 system, because the state has shared in the cost regardless of property value behind a child. So I think that's very progressive.
Any other questions in the room? One more, yeah.
So how would you change things if you could to make them, or what do you see would be as improvements to school funding?
Right. Well, we have, as Dee mentioned, we have new State Superintendent Jill Underly, Dr. Underly. She's fairly supportive, I believe, of the Blue Ribbon Commission recommendations. I believe she's also supportive of indexing kids in poverty, right? So in essence, what you say is a child in poverty needs a little bit more resources temporarily to help that child get what a child from wealth has. And so what you would say is that child counts more than 1.0, right? It could count 1.1 or 1.25, a child in poverty. So the state would provide additional state dollars for children in poverty. I think that would be a huge improvement in terms of equity, in terms of an equitable system in the state helping communities out, right? I mean, kids in poverty just need a little bit more help temporarily to bring them out and get them caught up, close gaps, right?
I totally agree with that, Bob. I also would probably add students experiencing homelessness could use that extra boost for those school districts supporting those students. I also think there's some significant work that needs to be done for our English learners, where we have not had an increase in that categorical aid for over a decade. And it's structured in a way that districts who have to serve a small number of students, which is still just as impactful, you still have to provide those students, whether you have one or whether you have 10 or 20. And I think providing those services and supports to districts that don't have a high number of students that are English learners, but still have some, is crucial to their success. And I also think that obviously a huge part of this conversation is our special education categorical aid. I'd be remiss if I did not mention that those are funds that are legally required to be expended to meet every student's IEP if they have one. And that in some cases causes a shift from the general fund to meet those needs of individual students. And I think upping that reimbursement rate really benefits all school districts across the state and all students as well. So. But that's if Bob and I made the rules, right? Which we don't, but we will keep fighting for those things for sure.
I don't see any questions in the chat. Are there any more questions in this room?
I have one question, just out of curiosity. Are there states who are doing this well? Like that are model, like good exemplars for equitable school funding?
I am just going to jump in here and say that while the funding portion of our formula hasn't always met muster, the actual structure of our formula is looked highly upon by other states in terms of our balance between property taxes and the general fund supplementing that. Obviously, tweaks certainly need to be made, but it's really about the level of funding that's put into the system at this point. So it's not that the system is totally broken, it's that the confines of the system with the limited funds put into it have created a difficult situation for school districts. But when folks examine how funding systems are laid out, Wisconsin is actually looked at as one of the better models. It's just the level of funding put into it is where we struggle. I don't know if Bob wants to weigh in on that at all. He's more of the finance guru.
Dee, you did a great job. I mean, and the question was already asked. I think I absolutely agree with it. I'm a big proponent, as is State Superintendent Underly in the administration, about the equalization aid in terms of equalizing property tax base. I think we all agree it would be a great improvement if we could get some indexing for children in poverty and bilingual bicultural education in terms of the additional state dollars, right? I mean, pretty common sense if you spend some time thinking about it, that there are certain groups of kids, no fault of their own, just need a little extra help at different parts of their life. And so it's just giving kids what they need when they need it to be successful. And it wouldn't take much. It would not take much. So we do have a good, strong system though. It's complicated, but it works.
Anything else?